despite its geopolitical prominence, is flanked by but two countries. To the north, the 5,525-mile, 8,891-kilometer line separating it from Canada represents the longest border in the world. To the south, the 1,954-mile, 3,145-kilometer US-Mexico border is perhaps one of the most significant in the world. It separates two of the most economically and socially interlinked countries in the world. The US buys more from Mexico than any other country, Mexico buys more from the US than any other country, and Mexico sells more to the US than any other country. Beyond that, there are some 37 million people living in the US with Mexican ancestry, which is a truly staggering statistic. That means there are more Mexicans living in the US than there are people living in Canada, full stop. Both the US and Mexico rely hugely on this continuous flow of people and money back and forth, which means how well this border functions is directly tied to the success of both countries. Unfortunately for both, though, this border, while significant, has its issues. A border and its effectiveness involves far more than the line itself. It's about how well the overall immigration system between the two countries functions, but at the end of the day, that line is still quite important. The Mexico-US border is crossed more than any other restricted border in the world, meaning it's actually quite porous. There are 50 spots where one can legally cross the border by land. The smallest is the tiny Boquillas port of entry in Big Bend National Park, where about 11,000 annual travelers are processed remotely using video inspection kiosks, mostly to make day trips to the small Mexican town of Boquillas del Carmen while vacationing in the national park. On the other hand, the largest crossing is the San Ysidro port of entry, processing 11 million pedestrians and 26 million cars per year, thereby making it the busiest land border checkpoint in the Western Hemisphere. As part of the primary route between San Diego and Tijuana, two cities between which people commute on a daily basis, this crossing is never not busy. The rest of this 1,954-mile, 3,145-kilometer line beyond those 50 checkpoints is secured, as to go from Mexico to the US or the US to Mexico, you have to go through immigration checkpoints, at least to do it legally. Each and every year, hundreds of thousands or millions of people attempt to cross into the US via the southern border without the legal right to do so. In short, they try to migrate illegally. Now, the vast majority of these undocumented immigrants are not successful in their endeavor. An estimated 55 to 85% of them are caught and sent back to their home country, but to many people, these odds are worth it. There is enormous economic disparity between the US, where average income is $65,000 per year, and Mexico, where that number stands at $9,500 per year. Also, while low compared to other wealthy countries, the US scores much better than Mexico on social mobility, meaning a poor person is more likely to become wealthier in their lifetime in the US than Mexico. In short, while there are certainly nearly infinite reasons why someone might choose to migrate to the US, including quite often family reunification or an escape from violence, research has shown that money and the attempt to escape poverty is typically the strongest and primary one. Of course, the question is, why don't these people migrate to the US legally? It would certainly be safer and cheaper. Well, overwhelmingly, the answer is because they can't. For some people, there is no legitimate route to legal status in the US, and to others, there's no practical way. Many forms of American immigrant visas have annual caps that are not proportional to immigration demand from a given country. That means that, for example, if you were a married Mexican citizen who was the son or daughter of a US citizen, the wait time to have your visa processed currently stands at 24 years. That means that now, in September 2020, they're currently only processing applications submitted up until August 1st, 1996. Faced with the prospect of waiting 24 years, more than a fourth of their life, until they can live and work in the same country as their parents, or, for example, take care of them in old age, many people seeking this and other classes of visas choose not to wait, and rather take the faster, yet riskier option of immigrating without authorization. While dangerous, the process of crossing the border illegally is a path generally not taken alone. Back 20 years ago, people had to figure out this process themselves, but nowadays, upwards of 95% of first-time crossers hire a smuggler to help them. That's an expensive proposition, with the average fee hovering around $3,500 per person. about 4 months' wages for the average Mexican. In exchange for their fees, these smugglers will generally group migrants together, transport them to the border, give them instructions on how to cross, and then arrange for transportation on the other side. The migrants and smugglers really have two choices in terms of which obstacle to face: the border security itself or nature. There is never no security, but in many places there is minimal, as hundreds of miles of empty, dry desert plains lay between the border and the nearest city where migrants can disappear into the crowd. This sheer isolation is a big reason why there is no physical man-made barrier on the border in almost all of Texas and across many other stretches in New Mexico, Arizona, and California. It's tough to get an exact figure as it's ever-changing and poorly recorded, but currently, only about a third of the border is secured with a barrier. In fact, the majority of that third takes the form of a vehicle barrier, intended only to stop a car or truck from driving across the border, rather than a full pedestrian barrier. Generally, there's only a pedestrian barrier in heavily populated areas like Brownsville, El Paso, Yuma, and San Diego. Even in these populated areas, one doesn't have to go far to find a gap in the wall. Starting from the western end of the border at the Pacific Ocean, the first wall-less section appears less than 15 miles or 23 kilometers to the east at the first section of steep terrain. Any barrier, though, doesn't tend to be too much of an issue for smugglers. Often, they'll have scouts on both sides, wait for Border Patrol to leave the area, then install a ladder and quickly climb over. Cartels have been known to go even a step further and build tunnels under the border. In January 2020, US Customs and Border Protection discovered the longest ever, a 4,300-foot, 1,300-meter structure stretching from Tijuana to San Diego. This facility was so advanced that it had ventilation, electricity, a rail system, and even an elevator.